Hello, Britlit. Let's get going with chapter 5 and 6 of Jane Eyre. So, Jane finally gets away from Gateshead. One of the ways to think about this book is in chunks where the setting changes. So, for the first 4 chapters and, just a tad into chapter 5, you can think of that as the Gateshead section, because she is, of course, at Gateshead that whole time. But as you saw with chapter 5, it opens with Jane having to get on the coach. And what you need to picture with the coach, it's like a stagecoach. Have you ever seen that in old movies and stuff? Like it would be drawn by a bunch of horses, usually sometimes 4 or 6. And then you would have an inside part, which is where they put Jane. And then the cheaper seats were you would ride on top, up where the luggage was strapped. So if it rained or anything like that, you just got rained on. But the stagecoaches ran a really regular schedule. And so it would be very much like the way Greyhound bus lines used to run. I mean, I know they still do, but they're not everywhere. When I first moved to Milledgeville, there was a Greyhound bus line that ran through Milledgeville. They used to be a lot more prevalent than they are now. So that's why she has to be up at such an early hour, because they're putting her on the coach to go. And I thought it was interesting that the lady down at the end where the gate, the lady there and her husband are right there at the end of the property, which is where the stagecoach stops. And she asks how far away is Jane going. And when Bessie says she's going 50 miles, she's like, good grief. I mean, just imagine, would you put your 10-year-old child on a Greyhound bus to go by themselves somewhere for 50 miles? That's not something any normal person would do. So once again shows how Mrs. Reed was quite neglectful in taking care of Jane. And so do you remember what Jane said whenever Bessie asked her, did you say, do you want to step in and say goodbye to Mrs. Reed? And she was like, nope. She said Mrs. Reed had already come to her the night before and said that there would be no need to tell anybody goodbye in the morning and disturb them. So she was happy to leave. She said goodbye to Gateshead as she was walking down the lodge. But once she gets on the coach, it's pretty scary. I mean, she's there by herself. I mean, there's a bunch of other people in the coach, but she doesn't know any of them. And for the most part, she doesn't describe the actual coach ride that much. But sometimes they have to stop and change out horses, because horses can't just keep going forever. And just like we would stop and get gas, they would stop and change out horses at various little inns and stuff like that along the way. And they stopped at one, and she was really scared because she thought kidnappers were going to get her, which, could have happened. But luckily, she did finally make it to Lowood. And it was dark, and she goes inside, and, a servant takes her in, and she's been sleepy. You remember how when you were young, and sometimes you would travel somewhere with your parents, and then you would arrive, and sometimes they might even have to carry you in because you'd fallen asleep, and then everything feels so unreal. You're like, where even am I? And so I kind of get the sense that's what she was feeling. And so Miss Miller is the one leading her around, but a tall, very pretty lady that we find out later is Miss Temple, is very kind to Jane. She, asks how she is and does she need something to eat, and tells her she hopes she'll be a good girl, and just seems like a very calm type of reassuring adult figure, which Jane has not had any interaction with before this time. So she's sort of shadowing that evening and the first day. If you shadowed before you came to GMC, you might have some sense of what that was like. Jane's never been to a school, and this school is very uniform at Lowood Institution, kind of like GMC. They operate on the bell system. They have a very set schedule where they do certain things, and everybody's wearing basically a uniform because they're all wearing the same thing. And Jane is just bewildered by all of it. She's never been around anything like this. So she just kind of quietly watches that evening and the next morning. When they go upstairs to the bedroom, it's like a long dormitory room. So if you ever watch the old Little Orphan Annie, that's kind of what I picture, because there's all these beds going down this long room. So it's just like one big room, and there's 2 to a bed, which was very normal back then. Like, even, I think we've talked about it before, even if you stopped at a posting house or an inn for a night, you might wind up having to share a bed with somebody you didn't even know. And so it's 2 to a bed, and so she falls asleep, and it's really, really cold. The next morning they have to get up and wash, and then they go down and they have to have prayers and Bible readings and all of this before they ever even get breakfast. And so when they finally go into breakfast, Jane is really hungry because she didn't really eat anything the day before. But if you remember, something was wrong with the breakfast. Do you remember? The porridge was burned. So porridge is basically like oatmeal. And it was burned, and it was just disgusting. Like, they just couldn't eat it. Jane tried. She was hungry. But you just couldn't force it down. And all the other girls obviously felt the same way, and so did the teachers. So then they get ready to start their lessons. And again, she's just shadowing, so she's just kind of watching how everything happens. And in this time period, they would have had not individual schoolrooms, but like one great room, and they would just kind of separate off into the different corners of the room, and that would be like first form, second form, third form, stuff like that, and that's where they would sit. And so you'd kind of hear the hum of teaching going on all around. It would be kind of like if we decided to have class in the gym or something, you know, with a bunch of other classes meeting in there at the same time. You can imagine it'd be kind of difficult to pay attention. So finally, while the classes have begun, Miss Temple comes in, and she says that seen in broad daylight, she looked tall, fair, and shapely with brown eyes. And so just very pleasant looking, very nice. Her name's Maria Temple, and she says she needs to address the pupils. So Mr. Brocklehurst, like, runs the school, but Miss Temple's kind of like the principal. You know what I mean? Like, she's a teacher there, but she also is in charge. But she has to answer to Mr. Brocklehurst. And so she says that she has a word to address to the pupils. So she says, "You had this morning a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry. I have ordered that a lunch of bread and cheese shall be served to all." And everybody looks at her with surprise. Even the other teachers, kind of like, "Oh, you're going to get in trouble." And she says, "It is to be done on my responsibility," and then leaves the room. And so they all get bread and cheese, and they're all really excited because they were hungry. And so obviously, kind of shows you that Mrs. Temple is willing to go to bat for them, you know, make sure they don't go hungry. And so then in the afternoons, they're supposed to go outside for exercise, but it's really bitterly cold. And so they go out into a little garden, but, I mean, you know, it's winter, so everything's dead. It's not very pretty. And Jane is reading a plaque on the outside of the building that says Lowood Institution. And so she's trying to figure out what that means when she hears somebody coughing and turns around, and it's a girl a year or two older than Jane reading Rasselas, which was a moralistic novel by Samuel Johnson. And so she goes over and strikes up a conversation with her. And she's asking her all kinds of questions. She asks her about her book, but the book seemed boring to her. She asked her why it's called Lowood Institution. And the girl she's talking to is named Helen Burns. And she explains because it's partly a charity school, that all of the girls there have either lost one or both parents. And Jane said, so, you know, we don't pay any money? And Helen said, no, we pay, or friends of the family or somebody pays £15 a year for each person. And Jane says, well, then why is it a charity school? And she says, because that's not enough to cover everything. It's kind of, again, similar to GMC, because, like, you know, you pay tuition, but your tuition is not enough to cover, like, all of our facilities at GMC and the pay for the teachers and just everything. You know, it's only a part of it. That's why we're tuition-based, but we still get state funds as well. And so Helen explains to her that there are some nice people who donate money to the school, to see that the orphans get raised. And she explains that Miss Temple has to report to Mr. Brocklehurst, and she kind of hedges when Jane asks, is he a good man? She says, well, he's a clergyman and is said to do a great deal of good. Remember, Mr. Brocklehurst is the one she's already met. We've already been introduced to him. And so she's asking a little bit about all the other teachers, and finally Helen's like, go away, I want to read. And so they continue throughout the day, and she sees that, I guess in the late afternoon, one of the girl that she'd been talking to, Helen Burns, got in trouble. And since she got in trouble, she was sent to stand in the very middle of the large schoolroom, where everybody could see her, in disgrace. I guess kind of like standing in the corner, except she's having to stand out in the middle of everybody. And she thought, oh, that'd be terrible. How can she bear it? But Helen just stands there very quietly, looking like her mind's on something else, and it doesn't really seem to bother her. And so then that night, they have the half an hour's recreation, a glass of water, and a piece of oat cake, prayers, and then to bed. So that ends chapter 5. So the only question I put for chapter 5 was, how did Miss Temple contrast with the character of Brocklehurst? Obviously, she seems to be a very kind person, seems to care about the students there. Helen and the other girls seem to have a good opinion of her. Jane likes her immediately, whereas Mr. Brocklehurst, remember we said, was, pretty hypocritical in how he treats his own children one way and then treats these girls at the school very differently. And you'll see more about him in the coming chapters. But how Mrs. Temple's character compares to other adult characters, Jane has never really met anybody like Mrs. Temple, or Miss Temple. Miss Temple is very kind and very nice, very benevolent, and that's the first time Jane's experienced that, so that's new for her. So chapter 6 starts off, and, the previous day Jane was just shadowing, but now she has to actually, take part and get involved. The day starts out pretty rough, because they're supposed to get up and wash their face and hands at a basin at the foot of the bed, which would just be, like, they don't have running water. It would just be like a jug, and then you pour the water into this big bowl to wash your hands and stuff. And it's frozen. I can't even imagine how cold that would have to be for the water inside to have frozen. I know whenever I used to have a garage, I would put my dog's bowl of water in the garage, because even if it got down to 19 degrees outside, the water wouldn't freeze as long as it was in the garage. So it had to be bitter cold. So they get up and get dressed, and the porridge was not burnt, but it was very small, and Jane wished she'd had a lot more to eat. So she is sort of proceeding with the lessons. It was really hard for Jane. She hasn't really had any formal schooling at all. They never even mention a tutor or a governess from Gateshead, so I don't know if they had anybody working with them other than Bessie. So it's really hard for her to memorize things, which was the entire way learning was done back then. It was lots and lots of memorization, so she finds that difficult. So eventually later in the afternoon she's allowed to just kind of sew, and they all have to sew at one point, because, they've got that's definitely a necessary skill everybody had to have back then. And so while she is working on that and holding the muslin for Mrs. Smith, or Miss Smith, she sees Helen getting in trouble. And Miss Scratchard is just chewing her out, and she's looking over there like, what on earth? And so then, something else must have happened when Jane's attention was away, but when she looks back, she realizes that Miss Scratchard was sending Helen to go to the closet and get something. When she comes back, it's a bundle of twigs, and she makes Helen, unloose her pinafore, which is her dress, and pull it off of her neck, and sharply inflicted on her neck a dozen strokes with a bunch of twigs. So she takes the twigs and kind of whips her, but on the neck, which would hurt. That sounds like that would hurt so bad. And so she's still just getting on to her. And Jane is outraged. You know, she has gotten this fire in her belly that you need to stand up to your oppressors and all of that. And so later when she gets a chance to talk to Helen, she's like, oh, you know, if that happened to me, I would have snapped the twigs under her nose. Like, how could you stand it? And Helen is just a very different character. She's like, you probably would not have done that. You know, and it wouldn't have done any good if you did. You'd be expelled, and you're here to get an education and all of that. And so Jane is just really filled with wonder at Helen's attitude, because that's not what she has recently learned is the way to handle oppressors. And so she's asking her more questions about it. So Helen Burns, the number 2 there, Helen Burns is very wise for her age. And the way her manner and how she thinks and talks about others really reminds you a lot of Jesus in the Bible, because she is very much turn the other cheek and forgiving and all of that. So her philosophy is very much turn the other cheek and try to see the good in everybody. And so then she says, you know, you should forgive your enemies. And Jane's like, oh, no, I'm not interested in that. Because Helen says, read the New Testament and observe what Christ says and how he acts. Make his word your rule and his conduct your example. And Jane says, well, what does he say? And Helen said, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you and despitefully use you, which is from Matthew 5:44. And Jane was like, no, then I should love Mrs. Reed, which I cannot do, and I should bless her son John, which is impossible. So Jane's like, no, I'm not about that New Testament life. And so then Helen asked her to tell her the story about Mrs. Reed, and she goes into all of it. And once she gets done, Helen tries to make the point to her that, you know, yes, she stood up to her and everything, but where is that getting her now? You know, she says you need to try to forgive her. She says she was unkind to you, but how minutely you remember all she has done and said to you. What a singularly deep impression her injustice seems to have made on your heart. Wouldn't you be happier if you tried to forget her severity together with the passionate emotions it excited? So she points out that you should look towards heaven, you should forgive your enemies, and that holding on to that hatred that she has for John and for Mrs. Reed is not going to do anything to them. It's just going to hurt her, and it's going to turn her soul. So that is really kind of what we go into here with how Jane is more Old Testament while Helen is more New Testament. Because, you know, New Testament, of course, is, you know, turn the other cheek. Whereas Old Testament is what? Like, what's the thought if somebody harmed you in Old Testament? Do you remember? Eye for an eye. So that's, you know, the way Jane has started thinking, and Helen's trying to tell her that if you turn the other cheek, things actually work out a lot better. Okay? And so that ends that chapter. So this is the first time that we're going to do one of the classwork assignments. Remember I told you that we would sometimes have a reflection to write. So I want you to do 1 or 2 well-developed paragraphs. Follow the normal formatting. Times New Roman, font size 12, double space. Excuse me, like you always do. But what I want you to do is to submit it to turn it in, and I want you to fully describe a time where you felt like Jane, where you were new in some place that was already up and running and everybody else seemed to know what they were doing. So it could be coming to GMC for the first time. It could be going to another school for the first time, or maybe you decided to go to a different church and you didn't know what was going on. Something where you kind of felt very out of place and had to sort of watch people to see what was going on. So that's going to be our first classwork assignment. Do some really good writing for me. Proofread, please. Okay? Sounds good. Talk to you later.